Welcome to Thinking Like a Composer. Just to introduce who's up here on the platform. We've got John and Paul over there on violin. We've got Jenny on the viola. And we've got Lucy on the cello. Over here is Edmund, and my name is Julian. So we'll be taking you through today's session, Thinking Like a Composer. Thank you very much for joining us. So the music you just heard was, of course, you'll see there, it says, it doesn't anymore, but it says Worst Place to Be a Pilot, which was a Channel 4 series that was on, I think, sometime last year. And in that series, for that whole sequence, we kind of started out with some Indonesian gamelan, because it followed the exploits of young British pilots who were trying to get airtime, their first forays into commercial flying. And it's a very dangerous place to fly, out in the jungles of Indonesia, kind of the worst place to do that. So we started out with this Indonesian gamelan, and then we went towards a kind of, I suppose like a David Holmes style funk, kind of very cool funk stuff, because they had sort of really cool lives out there, the sort of live they wouldn't have back in the UK. But actually, we wanted a really expansive soundtrack for that, and we ended up with what you heard there, which was really based on Florence and the Machine. And we studied very carefully exactly how Florence and the Machine got their sound, and we did all sorts of weird and wonderful recording techniques to get those beats as big as they were and to make it sound a bit like the sound that we had in our imaginations for that. So now as producers and directors, you guys, I'm presuming quite a lot of you guys are producers or directors or interested in that sort of thing. How creative we get as musicians is kind of down to you guys. We take your lead. You can get the composer to realize legal versions of library tracks, or you can brief the composer with your view of how your project should be and allow them to exercise their musical imagination. There are merits in both, of course. We're thinking that probably because you've come here this afternoon, you might be at least interested in the second, I suppose, more creative pathway. And really that's what this session is really about. It's really an opportunity for you to get inside the minds of at least two composers and to see how we think and work, with the idea that this is going to enable you to be better informed so that you guys can go and select the right people for your projects and you can get the very best out of them. Now, we're going to leave, I hope, some time at the end of the session for sort of questions and answers, but I would say is if you do have questions along the way, it's relatively informal, just please feel free just to shout out and we'll do our best to give you a decent answer for that. So how do we get started when the phone rings? First of all, we dance around quite a lot because, we might have not been working for a while. We answer the call, we speak about the project, we go into the edit suite, of course, and we want to have a look at some pictures. And we're going to go in there with some things in mind. The first thing is we want to hear what they've got in mind. We'll have all sorts of weird, wonderful ideas about what we think, what we want the project to be and what we hope it will be. We might really want to write some orchestral music, and we'll go in there and it'll be drum and bass, and we might be a bit disappointed, but we'll go and take the lead from the people in the edit suite. We'll also want to know not just what style of music they're interested in, but also, do they have instruments in mind for it? And more sort of particularly, do they really dislike a particular instrument? Later on we'll be looking at Walking the Nile, and we were scuppered from the off because the series producer hated marimba, and it's like the go-to instrument for Africa. So we were kind of stuck with that. But, we want to create a sort of sound world for the piece. So we'll take the information that we get, we'll go back to the studio, and we'll start to plan through what this sound world is going to be on a project. And we'll build templates, we'll build a sonic palette of these different sounds. And from that, we're going to find a way into the characters and find a way into the film. And what we'll do is we'll hopefully try to unify things. Now, there are two sorts of scoring, really, on a fairly basic level, two sorts of scoring for documentary. One is post-scoring and one is pre-scoring. Now, the post-scoring would be where we take a finished, picture-locked project and we write to that. And that is much more work for the composer, but it's kind of how it used to be done, and it still is done, but it's getting more and more common to provide material up front now. We're seeing much fewer projects at Picture Lock. When I first started working 20 years ago, we were receiving documentaries at Picture Lock, and that's pretty much the first time we saw them. Now we're on pretty much week one of the edit, sometimes before. And it works both ways, of course. The benefit of what I'll call post-scoring, which is to do this work with a picture-locked version, is of course that we can include everything in the score, and it can be everything from the speed of camera pans. It could be particular nat sound that's in there, natural sound. It could give us the opportunity to foreshadow. If we know what's happening at the end of the film, we can put something in a cue earlier that's going to help us to get there. And in that sense, I suppose we could more closely follow that narrative arc. Now, the other version, of course, which is getting more and more common today, is this pre-scoring. And that's where, we would go and give the edit a load of music, and they would cut it in, and, we'd go on holiday for a week or something. And that's great. The problem with that is, of course, it can sound like glorified library music. Having said that, there are projects that it works very well for. And sometimes grabbing a piece of music that gives that little scene some pace or sits in the background. Music's never neutral. We do get asked a lot for neutral music. Well, every piece of music is going to make you feel something, but you can have music in there that is wallpaper. You can have music in there that's background. And sometimes that's enough. And for those times, this kind of pre-scoring is a really good way into that. And that's going to help unifying things. Now, whichever of those approaches we take on a project is going to be down to what the director, what the producer, what the editor are most comfortable with. But what we are going to want to do either way is try to give it a sonic unity. That is going to be our main aim. And on approaching that, apart from looking at the instruments, we'll also be looking at things like, which channel is this on? What's that channel's identity? What's the demographic for the program? If we take a program that we scored like Who Do You Think You Are? Well, we arrived in Series 8 on that. So the sound world for that was already kind of there. We were asked to revamp it, but it's likely it's going to remain acoustic because of the sort of program it is. We're not going to have an awful lot of electronic instruments in there because they just wouldn't fit. They wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, and with Who Do You Think You Are? It has an older demographic. It's family viewing, definitely, and it's a very successful long-running show. I think it's on Series 12 now, or something like that. And so, with the sound world already in place, we need the warmth that can convey these human stories. And although you've heard the strings playing a sort of action-style piece of music earlier on, strings are very good at conveying that kind of warmth, so it's quite difficult to replicate with electronic samples. And it's not just about the particular instrument to use as well. It's for us, it's a kind of harmony that we might use. And in Who Do You Think You Are? To go slightly musical, there's a suspended chord that's used pretty much throughout, because the show is about searching for your identity, why are we here, how am I made up the way I am, and so this kind of leading music that sort of hangs there rather than sounding resolved is the sonic palette behind the whole show. And with a show like that, we kind of found a really useful reference point in the score to American Beauty by Thomas Newman, which I'm sure you all know. Very popular score. When the film first came out, you could almost hear nothing but sound-alikes of American Beauty on TV. Just had that big an impact. But it worked really well for Who Do You Think You Are? So we kind of carried on with that style, because it's got a sort of introspection to it, and it's a little bit unusual. So we thought we'd just play you a little example of that. And this is a clip with Samantha Womack. I should just explain here that some of the clips we're playing will have audio on, some won't. Sometimes you'll hear clicks so that these guys can be in time. We're just trying to present the music in the best possible light here, so it's not necessarily as it would be finished. So you're not going to hear Samantha Womack talk in this little bit, but it just gives you an idea of this little sound clip.
It also gives you an idea of sometimes what we work with. Sometimes we don't get the dialogue, we don't get the comm until later, so we just get the pictures.
Very simple clip. It doesn't do very much, but sometimes, as we'll come on to later, the music doesn't need to do very much. It's enough. But without that warmth of the strings there, you wouldn't quite get that same feeling which that show really needs. And really, we just wanted to touch on the movie music thing again, because it's something that we have to deal with all the time. These days, we have everything instantly accessible. In fact, you can watch all these films online at the end of this festival. That's an example of how easy everything's to access. And we can watch films all the time. And if I wanted to find a score to a film, I could probably find it within 10 seconds on the internet, which means that we all have a much broader range of what we like and what different things are available out there. even game music these days, they hire big orchestras. It's a massive thing. It's a massive thing that people invest in. So it becomes a sound that people are familiar with, and it really affects what we do. So we have to take that into account. But obviously, sometimes we're dealing with this as opposed to the big Hollywood setup. So we joined the Who Do You Think You Are series when, as we said, on Series 8. So really, we just added our own little touch to it rather than create our own sonic palette. And what's interesting perhaps about that is that if you watch Long Lost Family, and I know Davina McCall is talking at 6 o'clock, or if you watch Secrets from the Workhouse, you will hear a very similar kind of sound. That's partly because we scored those shows as well. But it's also because it's the same kind of thing that's going on. They're not exactly the same show, but it's essentially about finding out your own identity, or the emotion of discovering a long-lost relative. They're all the same kind of emotions. So the same sound worlds are very much in place for all those shows.
The thing is, sometimes the sound world's just not that obvious. And with this, which I gave a little mention to earlier, Walking the Nile, which we completed, I think, just at the beginning of this year. I think it was on in January. This was a case in point, really. This was a four-part series for Channel 4 that was following explorer Lewison Wood, who's up there, and he was attempting to walk the whole of the River Nile from Rwanda all the way up to Egypt, and 4 one-hour episodes was going to follow him along that journey. And he'd travel through several different countries, of course, and so you're going to get a lot of different terrain, and the producers were very keen that this was going to be reflected in the production. Not just that, but each of the episodes was actually directed by a different director. So they did want the music to kind of try to draw everything together, and this was really part of our brief, to kind of be responsible in part for a kind of continuity for the series. Now, the first footage that we saw for that particular production was some rough assembly footage, and it was the guys, Boston Undule, who is the guide, and Lewison Wood out in the jungle in Rwanda. So we got nice open vistas of the Nile, we got lots of African jungle, we got the giraffes, we got the elephants and all that sort of stuff. And our response to that, of course, was to go straight for the marimba. And Jamie, the series producer, said, no, I hate marimba. So we still stuck with the African drums, and we kind of did that. And Channel 4 came back and said, it's a little bit, here we are in Africa. And we thought, well, yes, we are in Africa. But we took that on board, and we then came out with this kind of majestic string theme, because we like to find a way into a project by writing themes, really, to tie everything together. So we came up with this majestic string theme. What we tend to do is we'll have ideas, we'll look at the pictures as we're coming up with the ideas, and it doesn't matter how rough they are. Sometimes we'll just have them on a loop, sit at the piano and play, and be informed by the pictures, because we are, at the end of the day, screen composers are visual people, and our music lives with the visuals. So what we do then, when we've got something we quite like, we dump it onto the visuals, and here we had some pre-title material, and we thought, let's just pop it on there, let's have a little look at it and see how it looks. And that's what we've got here, is you've got the majestic string theme. Now, I can't remember if there's comm on this or not, but don't listen to the comm, just listen to the music. So that was us sort of placing a bit onto that pre-title and then doing a little bit at the end. I should just mention there that the strings on the recording there are pretty ropey. We knew that the guys that we were taking that to had the imagination to hear the musical ideas in it, so we didn't take the extra time to finesse it. If we are in edit and we can work out that, some people like to hear the finished product before they can really fully engage with it, then that's what we'd do. We'd spend the day or so finessing it, giving them the finished product, because if it's a difference between an idea being used and not being used, then that's what we'd want to do, obviously. And it's worth remembering, actually, that your first shot across the bow from a composer is just that. It's the first idea. It's okay if it fills you with horror, when you first hear it. Well, it's probably not okay. You're probably like, oh. But, it's the start of a conversation. And, of course, if there's even a nugget of something good in there, then that's saved you some time already, and you can get down to that in time. In this case, the majestic theme was all well and good, but it didn't really reflect what the film was, because as we got to know, this was really us just looking at pictures and going, oh, we'll write that. As we got to listen to the film, as we got to get to know it, we realized that really it wasn't so much about Egypt as Lewison Wood. the guy who's walking, and the relentlessness of one foot in front of the other. He was not going to always go to spectacular places. He gets to Egypt. It's not all sunsets and pyramids. It's tarmac roads that go on forever. It's litter and it's police harassment. And they wanted this to be in the music somehow. But also, they were very keen to explore Levison as a theme. So we were looking hard to see, if we need to get inside, if we want the viewer to get inside Levison's head to understand what's driving him on to do this, because that's what it was really about, then we needed to find the right instrument for that. And we played around with all sorts of stuff. We had a lot of time wasted on clarinet, which took us right back to pole, in the 80s, was it, or the 90s. But this wasn't a travel log. He would meet people along the way, but that wasn't the point of it. He wasn't Michael Palin. He's a guy that walks. And he wasn't Bear Grylls. He wasn't very televisual, so it was quite raw. So then we looked at reflective instruments. We looked at the harp, just too soft. And it was actually a temp track that the series producer was using. He kind of fell in love with it a bit. And it was a synthesizer, had quite a bit of synthesizer in it. And we were a bit unsure about that. It caused us all sorts of problems because in our heads, we were still in a very acoustic sound world. And this obviously would take us right out to the electronic world. And we weren't sure if all of these jungles and things which are quite organic, if they were going to take that. But actually, what it did was it took us somewhere else. It took us to where we ended up with Levison's theme, which was the guitar, but not the acoustic guitar as we'd initially thought. It was the electric guitar. And it was the sort of guitar that's got quite a lot of processing on it. So, this was the sort of sound. And basically, we just sat in the studio and we noodled around with the pictures, and we got the sort of strong power chords for the big pictures. We wanted a little bit of crunch in there, and then sus chords because this sort of questioning is travelling. And then the theme came out, Suddenly, it sort of a light went on, really, because this would sit really nicely with the synthesizer that Jamie was on about, the series producer. And so we ended up with this sort of sound world that was a curious mix of quite organic acoustic instruments and the guitar and the synth. Now, this next clip that I just want to quickly share with you is when Boston and Levison are moving from the lake towards Kampala, and it's got all of those elements in it. So it's got the kind of Levison Wood sound in it. That sort of movement, getting them from one place to another, you'll notice, the music foregrounds in that. We don't get com for quite some time in that clip. It's a bit of a go-to moment in documentary. Transitions seem to be a very important moment because it doesn't mess with the reality. And that's what we kind of have to preserve. And we'll say a little bit more of that on that later. But what we then did, we had this sound. We had this synth, we had this guitar. And we knew that we were going to go to different places that we could then represent with the different ethnic instruments. And they could be quite diverse because we were going to lots of different countries with lots of different sounds. But all the time, this glue was always there, the synth and the guitar. And that's something that you can't get from library. That's kind of what we do best, really, as composers, is bring that whole thing together in a unity. I just want to quickly revisit that pre-title. This is, I think, a slightly different cut. Because this is, if we want to see the first one as a kind of pre-score, so we just dumped some music on it. We were just testing it out, really, that majestic theme. But this one is a little bit more dramatic. This show was also a co-production, and it was going off to Animal Planet, and they wanted it to be quite dramatic, quite American. So we have actually in this sequence, this is 3 pieces of music, which are written to picture, but quite dramatic. And it ramps up towards the moment where Levison Woods talks about this tragedy. Now, the tragedy was Matt Power, who was a journalist, who joined them for a short time at the beginning of the expedition, and actually died of heat stroke was fine at 11 o'clock and was dead at 12 o'clock. And it was a real shock for everybody. And obviously there was a lot of talk about how they're going to deal with this in the programme, and should they even deal with it, should they carry on. And they did, and there was a subsequent talk about how we might deal with it as well. Do we score this stuff? And I would say our general feeling about scoring heightened emotion is that we don't really do it in documentary. It's a real difference, I think, between documentary scoring and drama scoring, where it's getting more subtle now, I think, dramatic scoring anyway, but where you might go to more music for a heightened emotion moment. In documentary, if you hold back, then you kind of keep hold of that reality. And as musicians, we don't want to mess with that. That we don't want the willing suspension of disbelief. We want them to be in the story. So this sequence is the pre-title with a sort of through scored. Now, we had quite a long time to work on this particular production. It doesn't always happen that way, but we were very early on in the edit, and it was quite a long edit. And I think they had a little break in the middle, so we had plenty of time to experiment. But if you don't, if you're a composer and somebody wants the music now, music takes time to think of. So we have to have a kind of bag of tricks, really. Now, these are the things that we get to, that we know, the things we know that work. Because of the experience that we've had. So it makes sense that if you're looking for a composer, obviously you need to know kind of what they've done, but you need to know that their bag of tricks is the right bag of tricks for you. And, maybe we should turn our attention now to finding a composer.
Yeah, so we're just going to sort of touch on the practical side of these things, really. There are plenty of places you can go to find composers. Composing for screen is just becoming more and more popular. Conservatoires, universities, many of them are offering masters in specifically that, which was not the case 10 years ago. So there are many more composers for screen coming out. There are places like the National Film and TV School, which produces an incredible amount of very well-known composers and directors, of course. And there are online organisations like Berkeley and ThinkSpace. There are indeed professional bodies that set up for composers, that we belong to some of these. There's the Incorporated Society of Musicians, BASCA and Soundcheck, and you can get in touch with them, and they will put you in touch with composers, give you a starting point. So, as I sort of intimated already, composers are everywhere. And it's not really a problem in finding them, it's actually finding the right ones. And we certainly found over the time that we've worked together, which is sort of 12 years or so, that the best method seems to be word of mouth, and 80% of our work comes from word of mouth. The thing is with composers that when you're working with them, you're actually going to be handing over a lot of power to them, and that sort of hopefully you'll get that from our talk, if you don't already appreciate music, how much of a difference it can make to what is being shown in a clip or what you think the emotion is behind it. We can make or break your film.
We can ruin it.
Hopefully we won't ruin it for you, but there is a lot of power in it. And the trouble is that often when directors and editors working on a documentary or any film, they're sat in an editing suite day in, day out for a very long time, and the composers are not there. We're sat somewhere else working on the tunes and communicating, obviously by phone or email or internet, but essentially we're left to get on with things and then hand over the music and then get some feedback. So you have to be able to trust them, and obviously you have to be able to like them, because you're dealing with quite sensitive things. If you don't like somebody's track, how do you tell them that? This is something we might have poured our hearts out, and then you listen to it and go, no, don't like that. That's quite heartbreaking, because we're artists, of course. We're not just practical people churning out tunes. Sometimes we are. Anyway, so really, when you start, you've got to find something that you like about a composer's music. Now, that doesn't mean that if you go to a website and you listen to some tracks and you don't hear anything that you like, that they are not the right composer for you. Screen composers write in all manner of styles. We are, as you can see already, we're not writing in one particular thing. It may be that you go to a composer because you've heard a particular track and you like that thing, but that doesn't mean it's all that they do. It's a composer's constant problem, actually, is that they're always rung up to produce the same piece of music they did on their last job. And that's great, because they can do that, but actually sometimes you're looking to do something else. And if you're looking at a composer's website, I think you have to be quite careful to look past what you're seeing. Websites can be very impressive and look wonderful. If a website doesn't look very good, that doesn't mean the composer's not very good. Similarly, if a composer says they've scored 10 feature films. Well, that sounds really impressive, but maybe they're just 1-minute student shorts. That doesn't mean that they're a bad composer equally, and obviously everybody has to start somewhere, but it's just to be able to look past those kind of things and find exactly what it is you want. If there isn't any material that you like on the website, there's no harm in getting in touch with the composers themselves and sort of making them do a pitch or a demo brief. Pitch to a demo, if you like. We've certainly done that in the past. We can't put all of our tracks on the website, and if you have too many, then it's confusing as well. So I'd just say, look beyond what is on a website and see what it is that fires something up you might like. Obviously look at what they have done in the past and find out who they've worked with and talk to those people. Find out what the relationship was like. Did it work? And if so, why? What was good about it? All those kind of, I mean, it's sort of obvious things really. And I would just put in a brief caveat here that don't take the shorthand and find your composing mate or your musician mate to score your film. Now, they might be very good at it, but it is a very specific skill. So someone who writes concert music or someone who plays in a band and writes pop songs is not necessarily going to be able to transfer those skills to writing for picture. They may well be able to, and they've done it before, no problem, but it's just something to be careful about. And also a couple of other things that might be worth considering is what other things can the composers bring to the table that aren't immediately obvious. So for example, can they play an instrument, or is it that they just write music and hand it over to somebody else? The reason I mention that is that if you're using live players in a score, you could potentially save on fees, saving money. Both Jules and I, well, you haven't heard me do very much today other than waving my arms, but Jules plays guitar, I play the piano, and we play a number of other instruments too. And that really does save a lot of time and a lot of money, which is money is always an important factor. And actually on that note, why work with two composers instead of one? Are there any kind of benefits of that? Well, we certainly find it's inspiring for both of us, and sometimes it halves the stress as well. But also, we bring
one of us can go on holiday while the other one's working.
Right. We bring different skills to the table. I mean, Jules is very much jazz pop background, and I'm a very classical background. So between us, we feel we can cover a lot of things. And also, when we're sort of writing together, we can bounce ideas off each other and go in a new direction that, on our own, we wouldn't necessarily have discovered. We also got, I mean, having worked for quite a while, we know a pool of players that we can rely upon to record things at short notice, should we need to. We know a lot of the players in the RPO, and they know how we work. They know if I ring them up at 6 o'clock at the night and say, please, I need something by 7 p.m, they can record that for me. They'll come round and they'll do it for a mate's rate, and that's a really handy thing when needed. Actually, on that note, it's worth mentioning about remote recording, which is becoming much more popular these days, and it's very easy to do. When it's necessary, we scored a film that was set in Colombia a few years ago, and we were very keen to get the genuine sound, and I happened to have met a tip player, and a tip player is a small guitar from Colombia. I met him when I was in Canada, and he was perfect for this. So I was able to write some music, send it over the internet, he recorded it and sent it back. And there's the genuine article without me having to fly all the way over there. And it was perfect. So, you know, almost everything goes back to having everything at a touch of a button. It's all there instantaneously if you need it. Also, talking about sort of live instruments, it is standard practice, particularly on lower budget docs, but not just lower budget docs, to layer sampled instruments with live instruments. In fact, there's a talk about that tomorrow, which might be of interest to you. It's something Hans Zimmer always does in his film scores. Every orchestral score he has always got some kind of electronic element. Even the ones that sound very orchestral, they have synthesizers in there that give it that big, beefy, cinematic sound. And I just wanted to show you a brief example of how that might work even at this kind of level with the string quartet. You might have gone to sleep. Are you still awake? Good, excellent. So I'm just going to play you a little clip, but we're just going to play a bit of music first, and then we'll show you the clip. This is from a scene from a drama doc that came out last year. It was called The Great War, The People's Story. And very touching. It was all based on letters between soldiers and diaries between lovers and things like that. And this is, although you haven't seen this scene yet, it's quite a moving scene. We'll just play you a little extract for it, which is just scored for piano and string quartet, and then I'll talk a little bit more. cut it off for that hanging there in the moment. Now, these guys make it sound beautiful. It does work very nicely. This piano has got a terrible sound on it, so there's sort of two things going on already. It sounds great with real strings, sounds bad with a fake piano. It's easy enough, obviously, to find piano, and there are much better sampled piano sounds, but we just weren't able to bring them with us here. Now, that works very nicely, and certainly at the beginning, when it's just slow, intimate chords, it's a beautiful sound. But you can probably hear how the music builds, and you'll see why in this clip in a moment. But what we're able to do, even without having the budget for a full orchestra, is get the players to maybe all play a cello line, or maybe all play the violin line. So you've got, obviously given the ranges, whatever would work for the ranges of the instruments, they can all play one particular line. So instead of just one player on the violin, you've got 3 or 4, and then you can add samples to that, and you can add different samples to that on top. And the overall effect will actually sound like a real orchestra. So what you'll hear now is a mix of some live players, some samples. It is a real piano, and there's also hidden in the midst of it some French horns that are not real at all, but it sounds quite convincing as an orchestral sound well. Also, what I quite like about this clip, and something you can't do with real instruments, is that at the very end, I mean, this is a very touching scene. The woman discovers her husband is dead, and we touched on this earlier about how do you score that kind of thing, and we decided to let the natural sound take over. But there's just a few piano chords at the end, and we can artificially boost the reverb, and somehow, just by doing that, it sort of links with her emotion very nicely. Just gives you an idea of sort of what we might be thinking about when we're scoring a film. But also, how would you make your film appealing to a composer? Well, you can give them a large fee, I suppose. That's the first thing to do. But aside from money, which we will touch on in a moment, the composer's going to want to know what the schedule is. What's the commitment? Are they going to fit it in with what they're doing? Because it's quite usual for us to have several projects going on at the same time. I mean, fees for writing music for documentaries are not big, and they're getting lower all the time. So just from a practical point of view, we actually need to have more than one project going on. Large projects obviously do have higher budgets and therefore can command more time, but exclusivity is fairly unusual unless it's for a theatrical release. So the composer's going to want to know how much music is required and what style it's in.
Let's talk about money for a second. We'll get grubby for a minute. Composers have costs. I think there's this idea that somehow we work from home and everything is peachy. Running a studio is an expensive business. It's much like an edit suite, actually. The computers will be high-end. The software, of course, is professional. And the sampled instruments, some of which you've heard on the programs here, they can be pretty expensive. Vienna Symphonic Orchestral samples will set you back about £10,000. So how are you going to make your project appealing? Well, one thing will be to understand how it fits in with the revenue stream of a composer. And I'll just very quickly touch on that, because this is gold dust for directors, because you guys don't get told this, and it's important for you, I think. Composers have 2 basic incomes. We get the fee for writing the music, that's the composition fee, and then if we're lucky, we might get some money, the royalties, for the use of that music on a program, broadcast royalties. Now, those royalties can vary quite a lot depending on how much music is used, of course, but also where it's used. I'm really talking about television here. If you're on ITV, for example, you're going to be north of £100, per minute in royalties. If it's on Discovery, it's more like £1.20. If it's on one of the satellite channels, then those channels are sampled. So only one day a month do they check out what's on there. So if you've done a full series for one of these digital channels, satellite channels, and it's not on the day that they have a look, you're not going to get any royalties for that. Now, in those circumstances, the composer may want an increased fee, or they may want a split of publishing. Let's just talk about publishing for a second, because it's something that actually composers are all about. It's a big part of our core business, and you guys do well to kind of get a grasp on that. When we write music, we generate copyright. We generate intellectual property that becomes ours, and we can profit from it, and we profit from it by synchronizing it to picture for a fee, of course. Now, we can get 100% of that. That's all well and good. By the way, you don't have to know a lot about copyright. You only have to know this. This is the only thing you need to know, I promise you. There's 2 sorts of copyright for music. There's 2 sides. That's all there is. One side is the idea of the music, that's publishing. And one side is the recording of the music, and that's the master sync. So the right to put it, to synchronize it, the master recording on your program. If you can grasp that, then you are good, because you know how to clear music now. You'll go to the record company, or you go to the publisher, or potentially the composer. Now, when it comes to composers and publishing, in the UK, we have a slightly curious law that doesn't exist anywhere else. You can assign copyright, which means it can be sold, given, or, here's the thing, taken. A lot of production companies will require us to assign our copyright to them. This is perfectly reasonable, actually, because if they didn't, then every time they want to do something with that music, then they're going to have to come back to us and start asking our permission. You know, every time they want to put it onto Animal Planet or on the internet or make a DVD, you know, it would be crazy, really. So that's an understood thing. What some of these companies decided they might do, though, is create publishing companies. Because if they create publishing companies, then they can also share in a slice of the royalties. Essentially, they can pay themselves for putting music in their programming. And the law states that the writers, ourselves, we must have a 50% share in what we write. And the publisher can negotiate up to 50%. Now, what actually happens really is it's non-negotiable and it's set at 50%. And they take that. It's a thorny issue, really, with composers, because it's not really ethical. But it is the real world, and it is what happens. So now, if you are a director or producer and you're talking to a composer, and you know that they're having their publishing taken, as it's stated like that, they're going to lose half of their royalties. This can be quite a lot of money. This can be several £1,000s across a series. What are you going to do? You know, as I say, they may want to have the fee upped. Well, maybe you don't have that in the budget. Maybe they want to have the split of royalties changed. Yeah, but maybe you can't do that. So what do? Well, I guess you just be nice, because it actually does make a difference. If you understand the situation as a director or producer, then you can come along and say, well, listen, you know, we won't ask too much. It's going to be a great project, blah, blah, blah. We don't go into documentaries to grow rich, I think any of us. And if you did and you've become rich, then can you stay back and have a chat with us about it? We do it because obviously we love the medium and we love telling those stories. Now, speaking of that, I want to quickly move on to this. I think it's time for a clip. This was a clip that was a program called The Girlfriend Experience. And it's set in Venezuela. And it's a case in point, really, because I'd literally just got back from Venezuela when we were offered this. And I was so attuned to the Afro-Cuban music over there that I was really wanted to do it. Also, it was with a great producer that we really like working with. And it was a cracking story. And that's one of the main things. Now, the first question we had about it, because it is set in Venezuela, is how authentic did we need to be with this music? Now, I wanted to be seriously, deeply authentic because I had this newfound knowledge. But actually, in the end, we decided we didn't have to just have rhythms from Venezuela or just have instruments that are peculiar and particular to Venezuela, that we could look at the whole of Latin America. And the audience expectation would purely be that it just needed to be a little bit Latin American. So what you're going to hear in here, actually, the first piece is an Argentinian tango, and the drumming you hear later on is actually Brazilian, and it doesn't matter. It's all great. What I would say is that we dance a funny old dance when it comes to how our music reacts with creating a meaning in a program like, in a documentary. Should our music comment on characters? Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. That's the debate that we've been in, and we do it project by project. In this case, it's kind of gentle, but it definitely does comment on them. We see through the music what the working girls... This is about... I haven't told you, have I? This is about a brothel in Venezuela, and they cater exclusively to rich sex tourists. And so what the music does is it shows us what the working girls are really feeling about this. What are they thinking about these guys? And it also showing us the guys are largely oblivious to it. And there's just a very nice moment in it where the music foregrounds. So we have a sequence, and I think It's something that's really, it works very nicely in documentary if you have the guts to do it, where the director will allow the story to hold, if you will, or be advanced purely by music and picture. And it happens in here. And the music actually will have a gear change. It ramps up in tempo, and it ramps up in volume, it foregrounds. And then, of course, at the end, you'll notice on the little dolphin, as you'll see it in the swimming pool, we get another little moment where we just get a big crash on the drums, and it's a reverb tail. And this is another good trick. It's like the Leander gravestone moment. Because coming out of music in documentary, coming out of a music cue, can be a bit self-conscious. You know, we're aware the music's stopping, and then we go into reality again. And it can work very nicely to make a little statement.
Nice, really nice. It's not always easy viewing. Anyway, actually, watching that again reminded me that when I was playing around with that little tune at the beginning, I was thinking about Stormy Weather, that little song, and I put that in the tune just because I know what's going to happen. It's all rather horrible, which leads me quite nicely to the next point, which is about what if you are temping with a track that you really like, but you can't clear it? What are you going to do about that? Of course, you can get your composer to copy that track, but composers do often hate doing that, but it does happen all the time. And of course, it's quite difficult for composers to do because they can't, there's a copyright problem. The legal term is substantially similar in terms of music. Well, that's a suitably vague term, really. And the composer risks getting sued. And it's unlikely it's going to be the director or the film company, we're pleased to know, because often we've signed a contract that indemnifies against that happening for you guys. But it is a problem for us. So it's something we have to decide how close to go to a track when we're asked to do that kind of thing. It's not a comfortable position to be in, but it is something that we can do. And I just wanted to give you a sort of little bit of a take on that with this next clip, which is, it's the Pink Panther. Now, this is not the Pink Panther that you're going to hear, it's a tune by us. The Pink Panther is a very famous tune. It's very hard to go anywhere near that without actually it being the Pink Panther. So the way around that is to think about the essences of what makes that tune and get the vibe. And in this case, it's a kind of jazz vibe with a little ting on the cymbals. Can't play the actual tune, but there's a nice plucking double bass. And actually, even if you don't realise necessarily that this is referencing the Pink Panther, you know it's got a sort of familiarity to it, and it places it in the right sound well. And it seems to work very nicely. This is a pre-title to this show, Stephen Fry's Key to the City. And I have a particularly favourite moment where the editor on this just really beautifully places a moment where Stephen turns to the camera and says, wow, and it's in between two chords on the music, and I think it's just a really nice musical moment. So, it's not the Pink Panther, but it's that kind of world. It's close enough, and the director was happy. So let's say you've got your composer on board. What do you need to know about working with them? We need time to write. That's the first thing to say. We've already referenced the fact that things move very quickly with the internet. We can pass ideas back and forth, but writing is a creative process, and it needs time to develop. It's not just a matter of using the first thing that comes to mind. We've got to play around with ideas. You've got to talk to your composer to find out what is possible and what isn't within a budget. Again, it's very easy to hear something and go, well, you could do that, can't you? Well, no, not necessarily. If you don't like the music the composer writes, and you won't always, then you don't have to speak music. That is not a problem. That is the composer's job. But you should always try to explain what you mean in terms that you find comfortable. The key thing is to communicate, in whatever way that may be. But never just say something in order to say something. And we've all been in those kind of meetings where everybody's actually really happy, but then somebody feels the need to say something to look clever. And then all of a sudden there's a problem in the room, and it's a disaster. And even a passing comment can make a composer throw away an entire cue, when actually the cue was probably fine, but just something about it needed to change. And we would say that we need particular things. We've said that we like writing to pictures, that really helps. As soon as possible, rough assemblies are really good. But we also like to have playouts that are split track. So music on one side, Convoys, natural sound on the other, which means we can turn off the music or we can turn off everything else if we need to. That's really helpful for us. And also, if we're mixing to something, we can get the levels right. And don't forget that unlike commissioning editors who are potentially just watching something, we're working to it frame by frame. So a link to a non-downloadable Vimeo clip might be useful to watch, but we can't work to that. So we need more than just that. We just reference temp tracks, really, and, you know, they're a funny thing. They can be helpful in some ways, but they can also be quite tricky because we can't get too close. And I think Jules is going to touch on that in a moment, aren't you?
Yes, now shall I do it now?
Mm.
Okay, that's good cueing. So Atlantic Convoys, this thing up here, Atlantic Convoys War at Sea. This was something that filled us with horror when we went into the edit suite, because they were temping this with the Hans Zimmer soundtrack to the Batman film Dark Knight. And that was a multi-million-dollar the Hollywood soundstage recording that we were going to have to try to replicate using mainly samples and some overdubbing for about 0.05% of the budget. So we had a lot of sleepless nights. Lots of different samples. If there's any composers in the room, it was East-West Platinum, it was Hollywood Brass, it was Vienna Symphonic, it was Symphobia, all layered with Omnisphere. So quite a lot. We were running at about 60 tracks, I think, for this in the Logic Arrange page, so it's pretty big. In this clip here, I just want to quickly share this with you. This is called Dönitz Strategy. We had themes for key people, key moments and key people, because this was a drama documentary. Obviously, as such, it's going to have dramatic reconstruction. It's going to have a lot of graphics. It's going to have talking heads. And we've got to move between them. And we've got to hold all of this together. And I've spoken a lot about the unity thing. And we do that with the transitions. And in this, we're going to hear the Dönitz theme, which again is in the ominous low strings when you first see Dönitz in this clip. We go a little bit Miss Marple with the woodwinds when he's doing his, inside his head, he's reading from his diary. Notice how we get out of that. We do it actually with nat sound. We do it with a door opening. And they've used that very well here. So we've got quite a lot of natural sound filling up the audio spectrum. And then we go into some graphics, and we've just got this pulsing synth. And obviously, we want to be hearing what the information is, so we keep the music very basic. That's all well and good if you've got a long time to work on this stuff. The director of this particular sequence, it was 1 hours, and it was an international co-production. So the director was a Canadian film director. He was a motion pictures guy, and he wanted us to work in that way. And I think he flew into London for 2 days, and we spotted the films with him across 2 days, and then he flew away. We never saw him again. But he did speak to us a lot on the phone. And he was very adamant. He wanted everything scored. And we had, in 48 minutes of airtime, I think we had about 75 cues on each of the shows. So it was huge. And to put that in some sort of perspective, on this sort of orchestral material, we would expect to do about 2 minutes a day if we're working flat out. And that doesn't account for recording or mixing of live instruments. But one of the other things we found was, of course, we weren't able to work with quite a lot of the sound design. We did a bit of the sound design, but there was more specialist stuff and sound effects and nat sound that was required. And we didn't, unfortunately, get to work with that. We couldn't mix into it. So we offered stems. So what we did was the big orchestral cues would be broken down, of course, into constituent parts. So you'd have brass, strings, percussion, melody, drums, that sort of stuff. And it meant, obviously, they could isolate any bits of that. If they didn't want the melody, they could have it without the melody. If they did want it, they could beef it up a little bit. But when we came out of the mix, we saw it after mix, and we realized about 40% of our work was gone. We were gutted, I'll be honest. It was always going to happen, but we did sort of feel that it was a shame, really, because all of those sort of really melodic moments that were the director had spoken to us so much about were either very quiet, you couldn't hear them, or were gone. And obviously, if we'd been able to work with some of the Foley, some of the sound effects, some of the nat sound, then we would be able to, I suppose, concentrate our efforts in the stuff that was actually going to be on picture, on the sequence. But it does sort of beg the question that this was... it was a kind of a big thing. We were on this for about 9 months, I think, in all. It was filmed across a couple of years. And the budget was okay. It wasn't massive for the size of program it was. But it seems to be, whatever size of program, really, music is going to be tight. It's post-production. You've had to pay for that extra half-day filming, you've had to pay for the extra scene, you've had to pay for those things that you didn't know you were going to have to pay for, and the money's got to come from somewhere, and it comes from Schedule 30, it comes from music, and that's just the way it is. So how do you get the most on a tight budget? And I've touched on this a little bit before with this idea of pre-scoring, and something we used a lot in Who Do You Think You Are, and something we use now in Unreported World, which we're doing, which is current affairs series for Channel 4. We give them catalogue. So we will have material that we write ahead of time. We know that we're doing Unreported World in a couple of months, and we're writing on it already. And then we deliver them catalogue material, and those guys can drop it into the cut. If there's any sequences that they need us then to look at, to write to picture, then we can do it. And it's a kind of, in a way, it sorts out temp love. Because if they're temping with our stuff and they love it, good, it can stay. It's not a problem. You don't need a plan B. If it's just a placeholder and they need us to replace it, okay, fine, no problem. At least we know that that's going to be replaced. But also, maybe they need it tweaked to picture. And so it's something that's a little bit like a sort of best of both worlds scenario, I think. And it's something that editors who enjoy a creative use of music kind of get a buzz out of that. And if we can give them stems where they might have melody and no melody, drums and no drums, then they can really get very creative with that. I think they enjoy that quite a lot.
So we actually thought we'd do a kind of practical thing on how that might work. So we're going to, they're still good. So we're going to play a little track, and we'll just sort of take things out, add bits of the quartet, just to show you how you can still have the same piece of music that's basically doing the same thing, but by adding different touches, you can see how it changes the mood. And we've ended in a completely different place, but it's all the same music, basically. So it just gives you a little idea of how that kind of thing works. So we've kind of discussed a fair amount of approaches to scoring, and as we're coming closer to the end, we thought we'd just do a sort of live scoring, as you like. Hello.
Sorry about that.
I want to hear that again. So we're going to look at the pre-titles to a show, and I'm a bit scared about it, so I've got the director and producer sat in front of me here, of a film called Looking for Lowry, which is about the painter Lowry, and kind of explores his life in sort of fairly intimate details that we sort of haven't not been known about before. And Ian McKellen is the presenter on this film. And so I'll just show you the kind of first approach that we took to this, is the kind of exploring the darker side initially. So this is the initial approach. That kind of works very nicely to show that side, but it wasn't really light enough. He does have a kind of quirky side in this show. So we sort of noodled around with another idea and came up with this little thing, which I'll play on this piano. It sounds like this. Now, I'm not got a great piano here, but so it doesn't really work. This is why, I guess, composers don't these days go in and sit there with a piano and go, look, I've got this idea. What are you going to get from that? But at least perhaps we can try it on the string quartet and hear how that sounds. So we're going to play, let's just do the first 4 bars actually. Ready? Now already that sounds a bit better than me just bashing it out here. But it's not really enough on its own, so it does actually need to go somewhere else. So we kind of explored taking the same chord sequence, so it's still the same chord sequence, but just doing a little bit more. So we'll play from 9 to 16. A nice kind of quirky feel that this show needed, but obviously it's, again, not enough. So it's sort of going back to adding another layer on top. So we can push it somewhere else, and rather than just having the plucking, we could have a bowed viola in the middle of that. So let's just play whatever it is, 17 to, here we go. Quirky feel that's close to what we actually ended up with on the film. but actually it wasn't felt that this was contemporary enough. What you can't see from the pre-title is there are a lot of people who are interviewed, including people like Damon Albarn, and actually we needed to reflect that a little bit. So the end result is a combination of that kind of quirky sound world, but with a bit of electronics in it too, and some sound design and a bit of percussion. So here's the end result, which we will have a little bit of live stuff in it as well. So that's what we ended up with. So we're kind of drawn to the end of what we wanted to say to you, but we didn't quite use these guys enough. So we really thought we'd just end with playing you a track that basically incorporates the kind of things that we like, i.e. using all the elements we have in front of us. It's just a short little track, and then probably we have to leave relatively quickly after that, so we might leave questions. Please come and talk to us, we're not rushing off. But we're just going to play a little track that's called Marie Abandoned.
I'm not sure if we've got time for a couple of questions, very quick questions. I don't think there are any questions. Maybe we've sent you all to sleep. Yes, hello. Yeah, yeah, it's a bit nebulous, isn't it? I guess, yeah, how do you do it? That's a really good question. I don't know. I think it's a question of looking at what they've done before and looking at, well, I suppose what it is when you're talking to them, find out what they've done before, but also find any projects that they've had to do very quickly. What are they like on fast turnarounds? And listen to that music, because this is the stuff that they're going to be going to, that material that works. I mean, what would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to talking with who they have worked with as well. That's really how you're going to get a good sense of what they can do. Can they deliver the goods? Because we can all put incredible finished tracks up on the website, but can you do that overnight? That's what you need to know. And so it goes back to talking about finding work by word of mouth. That's the best way, I would say.
Yeah, just simple questions about how long does it take you to do this? If I want this style of music, how long would it take you to do it? A track like this, and they'll say, a day or 4 weeks. If it's 4 weeks, might be not work. I guess. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you mean you're providing individual tracks?
So by providing stems, did I mean that we were doing individual tracks? Yeah, kind of. What we'd normally do is, on Convoys, for example, it was kind of a big project and it was a motion picture style of working. So what we would do there is we would do full orchestral mixes with a 2-beat, so it would have a count in, and it would be a full reference mix, a stereo mix of everything, and that would be sent to the audio engineer who's mixing it as a reference. But then we would separate out constituent parts that made sense for the cue, but usually it was broken down into the orchestral, percussion, strings, brass. We would always separate electronics out, and we would always separate melody out, so that they could have the option of using this material without electronics or without melody. Because the point is that once we go into the studio and we start paying for, guys like this to come in and record with us, it's costly for us to go back and just take that viola out, or just take the cello out or something. We can't really do it. But we can do it if we do a separate mix. We can do it, or rather, even better, the audio engineer can do it. So that's what we do. And we still do quite a lot of stems for things that we're doing now, like, if we're giving catalogue, we still do quite a lot of stems for that because it seems to be a good way of working. Yes.
You used the term that I've heard before. You talked about a resolved chord and an unresolved chord. I know why you would use one or the other, but I don't know the difference.
Oh, that's a perfectly reasonable question. I mean, again, it goes back to, do you need to speak music? But I mean, all I mean by, have I still got a sound here? This is a resolved chord, one that just sits. It doesn't feel like it needs to go anywhere, whereas this one actually just has a slightly different quality to it. It wants to resolve to the other one. That's all I literally mean when I'm using that terminology.
It's just how it makes you feel, if you do, and that's the thing is you don't need to understand that stuff. If you want to know it, that's great. It's the third, or it's the third is resolving, and it's the fourth resolving to the third on a sus chord if you're into music. But the point is, it's how you feel about it. And we all know, if I sat downstairs on a piano, if you have a piano at your house, and I played a scale, and I stopped before I got to the end, you might want to come downstairs and just hit that last note, because we know this, this part of our culture. You don't need to have been to music lessons for that. We all know what that is. So it's just how it makes you feel, and I think that's the key with it. If you're communicating to a composer, communicate in your language, the language of the project that you're working in, the passion you're putting across in that, and it's our job to try and understand. I mean, asking us to make a track more yellow is, possibly not that useful. But sometimes, somebody said, it's 8 o'clock, it needs to be more 9 o'clock. Well, they're talking about the program slot, and I got that. Or, more New York City at night. Okay, so I kind of get that if they're talking in the context of something like, the Taxi Driver score, So if there's something that's got a context or an understandability to it, then it'll work, it'll be fine. Communicate in those ways, I guess. Yes, sir.
It was a great presentation. Hi, yeah, I'm Christian Vassi. I'm a film composer as well. It was a great presentation. There were just a couple of things that I thought might be helpful for directors and producers to add that was already in what you've shown us, but maybe as punctuation. One of the things that as composers we offer that library music doesn't offer is an ability to switch gear in a fraction of a second. When you get production music, it tends to have a tone, an emotion, a rhythm for its whole duration. What composers do is they're able to get from apprehension to anger to tranquility in fractions of a second. And if we as composers can convince you of that, then we're really beginning to kind of show you what we add to the picture. And the other simple point related to that is that we also can work outside fixed tempo. So whilst it's often useful to have a fixed rhythm that goes along when you cut to your pictures, Sometimes, emotionally, you want to switch right in the middle of that beat. And it's very difficult with library music. And again, that's what we have the great privilege of doing. So I just wanted to kind of make those 2 points.
Superb point. Thank you very much. One of us. Yeah. We need to stick together. Thank you very much. We need to, unfortunately, wrap up now. We are out of time. I want to just say, if you do have any questions, we are going to be sort of packing up, and we're happy to talk to you guys. Just a quick thank you to, to John and Paul and Jenny and Lucy. This is Edmund. I've been Julian. Thank you very much for coming along to spend the time with us. We've had an absolute ball. Do enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you.